So I have a slide, or actually two slides, but in return for that imposition, I'll stand here rather than behind the podium. So thanks, everyone. My topic is Navigating the Global Rebalancing. If you read the description, it's somewhat wider than that. It allows me to look at the critical factors that individual countries and the region as a whole must consider when assessing the future of the South Asian region. So I'm going to interpret it liberally and try and do a growth or a diagnostic framework of what ails South Asia. We've talked a lot about the causes and the outcomes. I'm going to try and relate them in the hope of offering a diagnostic framework. It's not complete, it's very early. I've been discussing it with people here and other places, and I hope you don't agree with all of it. Certainly the people I spoke to have not. But that's the idea. And it's not complete in the sense it looks at causes and outcomes, but not as carefully at constraints. Okay. Am I supposed to get very close before it works? Okay, that's it. I remember some time ago, I was trying to use a pointer and it wasn't working, and the reason was I was doing like this at the pointer instead of there. So this slide looks at causes. Now again, you could well argue with great justification that these are not original causes, and behind them there might be other causes. But let me start with this, and the whole idea is to try and present a diagnostic that might be useful. So the three causes, and again, if one wants to do it completely, there would be many causes and many outcomes and many constraints. A low capacity, then here I'm referring to state capacity, so low state capacity to devise trade policy. Second is low competitivity of businesses. And the third is a bilateral trust deficit between countries. And we can argue about my basis for this, so I'll give you a little bit about it as I go along. Now, I looked at things like trade ratios, but I also looked at, when I went across countries interviewing policymakers, business people in the different countries, this is what I came up with as the main causes. And if I look at the countries that are involved, so this low state capacity to devise trade policy, when I say devise, I mean design, I mean negotiate with other countries, with other stakeholders, including within a country, to implement policy, it's really weak right across South Asia. And we've heard several examples of that. I have my own favorite ones, including the requirement that yarn sent from Lahore to Ludhiana actually has to go to Bombay to be tested, adding about 2,000 kilometers to the route. So the inability, and there are various reasons for this. So the countries, I believe, all have this suffer from this problem. In terms of low business competitivity, as I said, I used trade ratios and my own interviews as the basis, and identified India, Nepal, and Pakistan as being the three that have the biggest problem of the countries in South Asia. And I focused on the 5 countries. I didn't include Bhutan, Maldives, or Afghanistan in my analysis. And the bilateral trust deficit affects pairs of countries, India, Nepal, India, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan. Again, with the hope that you won't agree to everything here, but this is what my analysis showed. And also this, of course, changes with the regimes. But I think one thing that's happened over the last decade and a half is, particularly with the NDA government that came in India in 1998, was an understanding that trade policy is an important part of foreign policy and must be taken with a long-term view in mind. So where earlier India would just ignore the countries of South Asia on the grounds that there's going to be a negative or a hostile government to India at some point, if not now, then in 5 years. And so we might as well just forget about trying to make progress. Now the view is, at least in the good times, let's try and do something which can last beyond a hostile government and become embedded. So So that's the good thing. But the adverse outcomes are, first is bilateralism, and this has been pointed out by others. It's invariably led by the large country, larger in terms of economic, political, military, administrative, whatever we might want to describe as weight, which means in these pairs of countries, India, except in Bangladesh, Pakistan, it means Pakistan. It's led by the large country in the sense that without any good reason other than that of might, as I just defined, the large country reserves to itself the right to initiate bilateralism. So if the smaller country wants to initiate an idea, it's promptly told to be quiet. And the large one will do it at its own timing and its own preferences. It's a bad thing because bilateralism allows for the exercise of asymmetric power, and which in this case means India in most cases. And that asymmetric power is resented and resisted, but unsuccessfully by the smaller countries. And this was mentioned by Mr. Muni also a few minutes ago. So bilateralism is an outcome of the bilateral trust deficit. If we come to high NTMs as a second adverse outcome, what we see is the causes are two. One is this low capacity to devise trade policy, and second is the low competitivity of businesses. The second one is a more obvious link. The low competitivity of businesses induces them to influence policymakers to put large NTMs, non-tariff measures, in place as a form of trade barrier that's acceptable in a WTO-mandated declining tariff world. NTMs can stay. And actually there's some evidence to show that they work counter-cyclically. In other words, in countries with low tariff barriers, you'll see countries with high NTMs. So that's easier to explain. As far as the capacity of policymakers, this has to do with the problem that they have is that if they do not really know how to devise trade policy, there's a tendency to focus on finished goods and to use non-tariff measures to protect themselves. So for bureaucratic protection, it's nice to put a lot of inspection procedures in place so that if ever the policy is found to be faulty, at least it's protected by a series of non-tariff measures. And then when I come to protectionist agreements, what I mean there is in the trade arrangements that are signed by countries, as opposed to the NTMs that they put in place, by and large, the arrangements are protectionist. And this again has been pointed out by various speakers. So what we know, for example, even if you look at the India-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement, arguably the most successful, it's not really a success if you look at integration. Integration of the core of the Sri Lankan economy with the core of the Indian economy. It's not that at all, because all the items that are core to trade are excluded from the arrangement. And most of the trade, about 80% of that, is actually outside the FTA, the exports from India to Sri Lanka. So protection arrangements are rife in the region, and these are outcomes of both the low capacity and of the state as well as low business competitivity. So coming now to the remedies. And again, many things will be done, but I think the key point is that how do you build capacity of the state? So one is you try and train ministries of commerce on governance. For example, how do you manage competing interests? I mean, in country after country, the same story came out in my interviews, that you have the line ministries who are supposed to implement policies, arguing with the Ministry of Commerce or in the different countries, and really the Ministry of Commerce tends to overrule them because of bad analysis. But there's a better process that can be put in place through training, accommodating other user groups who are outside government, understanding what value chain negotiation means. You know, if tariffs on finished goods range between 5 and 15%, and one country is thinking of a free trade arrangement with another, cutting the tariff on the finished good means cascading effects on the intermediates. And these are often completely neglected in the negotiation process. Understanding how to do that and what to do is key. Coming to the second one, introduce competition policy. This has been raised in selected sectors. You know, we keep talking of India-Pakistan trade, but actually trade in textiles, which is a core sector to both of them, not going to happen unless competition policy removes this huge distorting web of subsidies that characterizes both the sectors. And then you trade in trade associations to think long term. I think one thing that impressed me in my interviews was that in Bangladesh and in Sri Lanka, the business trade associations, the chambers of commerce, actually have built up some capacity to think with the government on how, if you put in a certain program in place, how it can be phased out, what sort of capital inputs are necessary, and so on. And India, Nepal, and Pakistan need to learn this soon. And finally, on the bilateral trade deficit, trust deficit, I think this is probably counterintuitive. I think the real problem is that India lacks trust in its neighbors. Not that the neighbors lack trust in it in India. And this needs to be built up. And it'll take time because India has had really bad experiences, genuinely bad experiences in many ways, in dealing with them from a security angle. And maybe the way to start is the one pair that where the situation is very good, which is not in my list of trust deficits, which is India, Bangladesh. You have a small window of a couple of years, identify bilateral projects with regional potential, such as water and power projects, and see if that then works as a base on which to build up further. Thanks very much. That's my presentation.